today's episode of Witty CFB, we'll be discussing NCAA officiating, particularly the past couple games this weekend where we, needless to say, saw some really controversial calls. And I do think ultimately this weekend is a testament to some of the changes that I think we need to see in the NCAA. Now, I'll be the first one to tell you that, you know, I'm all for the player safety. I'm all for trying to prevent concussions. I'm all for, doing whatever we can to help maximize players, life and all of that good stuff. But I do think there needs to be a line in the sand between, you know, trying to make the game safer versus getting to a point where the NCAA is just being too soft. I mean, it's getting to a point where I think there are a lot of comparisons to the NFL, which, as someone who loves college football, who's passionate about college football, who's been watching all my life, it definitely is a bit concerning when you see so many different parallels between some of the changes that the NCAA has made and how much similar it's getting to the NFL. Because I think for anyone who is a college football fan who loves it just as much as I do, I've always been a firm believer that any way you can make the college game different than the NFL, the better it serves not only the fans, but the players, the coaches, and all that stuff too. Because, in the grand scheme of things, 99%, 98% of these kids are never going to make it to the NFL. So what's the point in transferring the game and trying to make it more like the NFL when in reality, most of these players who are going to be there are going to try to cash in now, are going to try to get a degree and hopefully move on with their lives and do great things and be positive members of society. Now, with that said, I mean, this does go into, you know, NCAA did launch a quote unquote officiating reform initiative back in July of 2024. And I'm going to read the excerpt from the NCAA website where we're just going to talk about just a couple bullet points and then I'm going to elaborate on, what we're seeing with these bullet points compared to what we've been seeing over the weekend. So, quote, this agreement with RQ Plus, which is the officiating services provider for the NCAA, puts in place a long-term strategy to help serve some of the biggest concerns we've heard from the membership regarding officiating. We are committing the financial resources to aid conferences and growing the next generation of officials while better educating and supporting current ones. The initiative provides collective benefits for schools, conferences, student athletes, and officials by offering immediate financial relief for conferences, increasing the NCAA registered officials from 23,000 to over 35,000, ensuring better educated officials and consistent officiating through national standards in education and training opportunities, identifying and addressing regions experiencing officiating shortages, enhancing integrity through an officiating compliance program that includes background checks and sports wagering education, enhancing the student athlete experience with a continued commitment to a consistent, fair, and safe competition environment, creating broader opportunities for officials to work across conferences and divisions, and increasing number of officials eligible to work NCAA championships. Now, I'll be the first one to tell you, I've been begging for this for the past 4 or 5 years in terms of just too many games that are ultimately coming down to the officials on the field. Now, I'll be the first one to admit or say or whatever that I do think part of officiating any sports game really, I think there has to always be a human element to it, just like driving a car, for example. Technology can do this, technology can do that, but sometimes there are certain things that ultimately you as the viewer, you as the eye seer has to see. And I do think, for example, I mean, you go back 15, 20 years, for example, when I really started watching college football, the way that games were being played in the SEC versus how games were being played in the Big 12, particularly the officiating, it was different. It was different. The SEC can get away with a little bit more. It was a little bit more, some pushing and shoving here and there. There wasn't, these lollipop calls that you kind of that you see all the time, particularly in the South Carolina game. I think the South Carolina example that comes to mind, which they ultimately did have two personal fouls for pick sixes that ultimately got called back. But I think the one that gets a lot of attention is the South Carolina linebacker who hit Garrett Nussmeier as he is, trotting off trying to catch the quarterback. Now, obviously, they argued that it was quote unquote a blindside hit, which, according to the rules right now, I guess you can technically say that's a fair call. But at the same time, yes, that's the way the rules are written. But I do think there needs to be a gray area where there does need to be some context on these deals, on these calls, for example. I mean, when you sit there and you protect the quarterback so much so where defenders are, afraid or nervous to hit an opposing receiver or running back or whatever, it definitely hurts the detriment of the game. I mean, even when you saw the Georgia Kentucky game, for example, I mean, there were a lot of times where Brock Vandergriff was running around the pocket, and there was one play where the Georgia guy clearly sacked him, clean hit, shoulder, barely even touched his helmet, and then they throw the flag. So I do think there needs to be a balance between protecting the players versus also using common sense and saying, okay, when is this a personal foul or targeting versus when is this just a dirty hit that doesn't belong in the game? Now, I'll be the first one to say this too, and I think a lot of people watching this program would agree. But the uptick in targeting calls in particular, I think, has gone through the roof. I mean, I'm watching these games, and I get, I think we need to understand that part of playing this game is that there are going to be injuries. There are going to be plays where guys are just going full sprint, and there's only so much you can do in that moment. Like, for example, there was a play in the Texas A&M game where the wide receiver was going up for the ball, and the defender, he slightly kind of hit his helmet near his spine or his tailbone, somewhere kind of in between there, and it kind of forced the Texas A&M wide receiver to kind of, it was all up in the air, but they ultimately threw a targeting call on that. Now this is the real issue. Like, where do you draw the line between all of that? Because you can't, in my opinion, you can't penalize kids for being in full motion. Like, what do you expect? What do you expect the athlete to do in that situation? Do you do you just want him to catch the ball? I mean, do you just want him to catch the ball and not take a hit? I mean, if I was Coach Napier in that situation, or if I was Shane Beamer in that or if I was Shane Beamer in that situation, I would have sat my kid down and said, hey, we kind of got screwed on that call, but you kind of just have to go back out there and try to do it again. But I do think this week, I mean, even Kirby Smart said it over the weekend too. This is some of the worst officiating that I think I've seen in recent memory too. And I'm not one for being one of those people that say, "Oh, well, this call cost them the game," or "What about the one in the third quarter?" or all of that. But when you think about the South Carolina game, it's just so evident that there's just some inconsistencies in the game. Now, granted, it's a lot more difficult in the NCAA compared to the NFL, in the sense of, hey, in the NFL you have 32 teams, you have a handful of teams on a bye, so there's only at most what, you know 12 to 20 officiating crews, and you have a couple guys on standby in case the agreement with the referees association doesn't work out, or in case someone calls in sick, or whatever the situation is, compared to a college game where you have 130 something FBS teams plus just as many FCS teams. So that's 200 something games, and then you have a handful of teams. Let's say you have maybe quarter of them on a bye. I mean, that's over 200. That's really over 200 officials you have to have. I mean, the stat was 35,000 officials in this reform here. Now, even in this day and age of betting, I'm not going to sit here and say that officials are betting on games and they're doing this and they're doing that. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I do think that talking about this initiative, I think it just needs to bring not only attention to it, but I think there needs to be a sense of accountability to it too. And when you see coaches like Shane Beamer and Kirby Smart and all these guys, talk about this too, I think, ultimately this comprehensive platform that they're trying to start with RQ. I think it's important that, you know, athletic administrators, stand up, that coaches stand up. I mean, that's part of the problem too, is that yes, they can speak their voices and they, can speak for what's going on in the NCAA, but ultimately, like for example, Pat Narduzzi, he got fined as soon as he said something, a tiny bit of criticism about the officiating. So now we're in this cycle of, okay, you know, Mark Stoops or Kirby Smart or whoever goes says something to the media about a call that didn't go their way, and probably rightfully so. A couple days later, NCAA or whoever, slaps him with a fine, and then they pay the fine, and then the next day, on media day, they apologize for the outburst, or they deflect and say, well, we could have played better, we could have did this, and we could have did that, but it's just kind of sick of the same old rhetoric all the time in terms of, trying to fix something. And, to me, when you see these things happening, it just seems like it's not moving as quick as it should be. Now, granted, I get that, you know, things obviously don't change overnight, and yes, there are metrics that we have to understand. There are officiating trends that we are seeing, whether we're talking about it through a geographical lens or or the median age of an official, or all these different logistics going on. But I do think ultimately that we just need more eyes and more attention on this, because if we keep seeing this cycle of coaches complaining about the officiating and then just getting slapped with a fine, how much of this initiative stuff is really going to be beneficial for the game long term? Because, when you have even more of these playoff games where, you know, where advertisers are spending tens of millions of dollars wanting to be a part of the ads to these games, the less we can really, the less we can have, these officiating blunders too, because the reality is that there's more eyes on this product now. There's more competitive teams now, and one can argue that this is one of the best, times that we've ever seen for college football ever. And I would hate to see it be, undermined by shitty officiating or kind of half-ass officiating. So with that said, I think the main point of this episode was really kind of articulate the grievances that I think a lot of college football fans in general have with officiating, but also double downing and saying that I think it's awesome that these coaches are stepping up and, you know, trying to hold the NCAA and the officiating and this reform initiative a lot more accountable, because so far I haven't seen any results.